A team of archaeologists is crouched inside a narrow gap between two ancient stone walls in southeastern Turkey, and one of them has just brushed the last layer of dust off something that should not be lying where it is. Not standing. Not seated in a niche the way a carved figure is supposed to be displayed. Lying flat, wedged horizontally into the packed fill between two enclosures, as if someone 12,000 years ago wanted this figure hidden inside the wall itself rather than honored in front of it. The head is intact. The torso is intact. And the placement is deliberate enough that once you see it, you cannot unsee the question it raises. Why would the builders of the oldest monumental site on Earth bury one of their own carved ancestors inside the architecture, instead of standing him up where everyone could see him? That is the real find that has archaeologists talking right now, and it is stranger, and better documented, than almost anything you will read in the more sensational corners of the internet. So let's slow down and actually walk through what has been confirmed at Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites over the past year, what is still genuinely uncertain, and why even the careful, conservative version of this story is enough to make you rethink the opening chapter of human history. Start with the basics, because they still don't feel real no matter how many times you hear them. Göbekli Tepe sits on a limestone ridge near the city of Sanliurfa, and its oldest layers date back roughly 11,500 years, with some estimates pushing closer to 12,000. That places it before pottery, before the wheel, before writing, and before the first confirmed domesticated fields of wheat anywhere on the planet. It predates the pyramids of Egypt by more than 6,000 years, and it predates Stonehenge by roughly the same distance again. The people who built it left no metal tools, no draft animals, and no evidence of a written plan. What they left instead is a set of massive limestone pillars, cut into a distinctive T-shape, some of them taller than a person and weighing many tons, arranged in careful circular enclosures and covered in carved animals, foxes, boars, vultures, snakes, scorpions, cranes, alongside abstract symbols nobody has fully deciphered. For most of the 3 decades since excavation began in earnest, the working theory was straightforward. Göbekli Tepe was a temple. A sanctuary where scattered bands of hunter-gatherers gathered periodically, perhaps traveling from many kilometers away, to take part in rituals, then dispersed back into the landscape. That idea alone was already a quiet earthquake in archaeology, because it suggested that monumental construction, and maybe even organized religion, came before farming and permanent settlement rather than after. The old textbook sequence said people farmed first, then settled, then built temples once they had the surplus to spare. Göbekli Tepe suggested the opposite was at least possible, that the pull to gather and build something sacred might be what drove people toward settling down in the first place. That was already a lot to absorb. But the last 2 years of fieldwork have added new layers to the picture, and they don't simply confirm the temple idea, they complicate it in ways researchers are still working through. The most talked about discovery is that horizontal human statue, unearthed in the space between two of the site's excavated enclosures. Reports on the find describe it as roughly life-sized, carved with clear anatomical detail, and positioned in a way that indicates it was placed there on purpose rather than having simply fallen or eroded into that position. Because so much of Göbekli Tepe's imagery involves animals, a detailed human figure is unusual on its own. But it's the placement, tucked into the fill of the wall rather than displayed upright, that has archaeologists debating what it means. Was it a kind of foundation offering, a way of anchoring the structure with an ancestor's likeness? Was it meant to be hidden deliberately, a figure taken out of circulation rather than honored? Nobody currently working the site claims to have a settled answer, and that honesty matters, because the temptation with a discovery this striking is to reach for the most dramatic explanation available. The responsible answer, for now, is that this is a genuinely new category of find at Göbekli Tepe, and its meaning is still being worked out. A short distance away, at the neighboring site of Karahan Tepe, part of the same broader cultural network known as the Tars Tepeler, or Stone Mounds, region, excavators uncovered something that fills in a different piece of the puzzle. A standing stone carved with an unmistakably human face. Deep-set eyes, a defined nose, a strong jawline, worked directly into the monolith. This matters because for years the T-shaped pillars at these sites were understood as abstract, stylized representations of the human form, arms carved in relief along the sides, hands meeting at the front, but never a face. A literal human face carved onto one of these standing stones is the clearest evidence yet that the builders intended these pillars to represent people, or perhaps ancestors, or beings understood as more than human, rather than purely symbolic markers. At the same time, the way archaeologists are studying the site itself has changed, and that shift is arguably as important as any single artifact. For most of the site's excavation history, the primary method was digging, careful, patient removal of soil layer by layer. It's how nearly everything currently known about Göbekli Tepe was found, but it comes with an obvious cost. Every trench is, in a sense, irreversible. You cannot dig the same ground twice. With more than 90% of the site still unexcavated, and with growing awareness of how much can be damaged in the process of exposing it, teams have leaned increasingly on non-invasive tools, ground-penetrating radar, geomagnetic survey, and airborne laser scanning that can map what's under the soil without disturbing it. Recent surveys across the wider mound and the surrounding landscape have used these tools at a scale not previously attempted here, and the results have been striking. Instead of confirming a handful of known enclosures, the radar and magnetic data have revealed dozens of additional buried structures, circular and otherwise, tracing outlines that no excavation has yet touched. That otherwise is worth pausing on, because it's one of the more genuinely surprising threads in recent reporting. Alongside the expected circular enclosures, which have always been the architectural signature of the site, surveys have picked up rectilinear shapes, straight-walled, right-angled structures sitting in the same buried landscape. Circular enclosures at Göbekli Tepe are generally understood as communal or ceremonial spaces, places built for gathering rather than daily living. Rectangular structures, in the broader archaeological record, tend to be associated with domestic space, rooms, storage, the architecture of people who stay somewhere rather than visit it. If some of these buried rectangular features turn out to be dwellings, it would support a growing argument among researchers that at least parts of the wider Tars Tepe landscape weren't purely ceremonial gathering points, but supported longer-term, or even permanent habitation, which pushes back against the old idea that this entire culture was purely mobile and seasonal. And the landscape itself has turned out to be far bigger than the single famous hill. For years, Göbekli Tepe was framed as a singular anomaly, a lone flowering of monumental architecture that had no real peers. That framing hasn't held up. Karahan Tepe, a short distance away, has its own T-shaped pillars and its own enclosures. Göbekli Tepe, further along, shows related architecture, and may be older by some estimates. Seybük, another nearby site, has produced carved scenes that echo the same visual vocabulary of animals and human figures. Altogether, more than a dozen related sites have now been identified across the region, sharing enough in common, the same T-shaped pillar tradition, similar animal carvings, a comparable circular layout, that researchers increasingly describe Göbekli Tepe not as a one-off miracle, but as the most visible point in a much larger, mostly buried network of related communities that shared symbols, techniques, and evidently some common set of beliefs across considerable distances. That reframing raises an obvious question: if this was a network rather than an isolated site, what tied it together? One avenue researchers have started exploring is whether the recurring carved symbols, the animals and the abstract signs that appear again and again across these pillars, follow any kind of consistent internal logic. Cataloging and cross-referencing hundreds of individual carvings across dozens of pillars by hand is an enormous task, and some recent analysis has used computational pattern matching tools to look for statistical regularities in how symbols are grouped and positioned, the kind of repeated associations that would be difficult for a human researcher to spot across such a large and scattered dataset. Some of this work has reported non-random patterns, certain animals consistently appearing near certain other symbols, certain motifs confined to certain enclosures rather than scattered evenly across the site. If those patterns hold up under further scrutiny, they would suggest the carvings followed shared conventions rather than being purely improvised, individual expressions. That's an interesting and genuinely active area of research. It is not, at this stage, evidence of a written language, and the more careful researchers involved in this kind of analysis are quick to say so. Pattern and pictorial convention are not the same thing as syntax, and claims about the carvings encoding a decipherable message, or lining up with specific star positions to some precise statistical percentage, remain speculative and unverified. That kind of claim shows up often in less careful corners of the internet, and it's worth treating it with real skepticism until it's published, tested, and replicated by the wider archaeological community. What does seem well supported, and arguably more interesting than any speculative code, is the timing of all this construction. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were doing so during a genuinely difficult period in the region's climate history. The end of the last ice age brought a warming period, only for the region, and much of the northern hemisphere, to swing back into a sharp cold snap known as the Younger Dryas, lasting over 1,000 years, during which temperatures dropped, familiar plant and animal patterns were disrupted, and the environment hunter-gatherer communities depended on became considerably less predictable. Some researchers have pointed out that this is roughly the period in which the earliest monumental construction at these sites was taking place, and have floated the idea that environmental stress and unpredictability may have pushed scattered groups toward larger gatherings, shared ritual, and collective building projects, as a way of maintaining social ties and cultural identity during a genuinely hard stretch of history. It's a reasonable hypothesis, and it fits a pattern seen in other times and places where hardship correlates with increased communal activity rather than pure dispersal. But it remains a hypothesis, one explanation among several, not a settled conclusion, and honest reporting on the site treats it that way. So where does that leave the overall picture of what Göbekli Tepe actually was? Probably not one single thing. The evidence supports a site that combined ceremonial gathering space with elements that may represent early domestic use, memorial or ancestor-related practices suggested by finds like the buried statue, and a genuinely wide network of connected communities sharing an architectural and symbolic tradition across a broad stretch of southeastern Anatolia. A temple, in other words, but one embedded in a much richer, more complicated social world than the simple sanctuary for scattered nomads model that dominated the first decades of research. And all of that is based on a site that is still, by most estimates, more than 90% unexcavated. Every discovery described here, the buried human statue, the carved face at Karahan Tepe, the newly mapped enclosures, the rectangular structures hiding among the circles, comes from a small fraction of what's believed to still be underground. The next several excavation seasons are already being planned, and each one has a real chance of adding to, or revising, everything currently understood about how this remarkable chapter of human history began. If you had to guess what's still buried in that remaining 90%, what do you think future seasons are most likely to turn up? More evidence of daily life and permanent settlement, more carved ancestors tucked into the walls, or something nobody has anticipated yet? It's worth sitting with that question, because a site this old, this well preserved, and this incompletely explored has already rewritten the story once, and there's every reason to think it isn't finished doing that yet.